In this lecture, we are going to discuss The Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir. Basically, this book has three parts. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to cover all the three parts, but nevertheless, we'll try and see whether we can complete at least part one and to some extent part two. Simone de Beauvoir begins with an assertion that ethics can be compared to a game. Say a game that can be won or lost. So, and also it teaches us what it means to win. So therefore, in the first chapter of Ethics of Ambiguity, she tries to describe the rules of the game. So when she speaks about ethics as game, what are the rules involved in this game? To begin with, she begins to describe the human condition. Now, a human being is freed from being a pure object. Now, this idea is definitely from Sartre himself. You remember Sartre made a distinction between being in itself and being for itself. And being in itself is something that is pure object. So it doesn't have consciousness. Unlike the being for itself, it has consciousness. Now, therefore, a human being is freed from being a pure object because of the fact that the human being has consciousness. However, the human being cannot escape this world of object fully. In a certain way, you can assert yourself because of your consciousness, but you can also be crushed by the weight of other things. To a great extent, you are a subject in a world of objects, but at the same time, you are nothing more than an individual in the collectivity on which you depend. So therefore, the human condition itself is ambiguous. On the one hand, there is this consciousness by which you assert yourself, your individuality. On the other hand, this individuality is part of a larger collectivity. So there is nothing very specific about it. Now, de Beauvoir thinks that one of the major difficulties with the philosophers is that they deny this ambiguity. They end up emphasizing one or the other side of it, either the world of object or the pure subjectivity. So some philosophers emphasize the pure objectivity of the world, or others would deny the world as an illusion which your subjective mind can overcome. So therefore, the ethics that these philosophers who deny the objectivity or they overemphasize the objectivity basically would lead to a kind of lopsided understanding of ethics. It is either an ethics that makes oneself pure inwardness or makes oneself pure externality. So you are either escaping from the sensible world or you are completely engulfed by the sensible world. But at the same time, this feeling of ambiguity remains there all the time. And therefore, any ethical step that you take by ignoring one or the other aspect of the human condition is necessarily unsatisfactory. De Beauvoir tries to understand her world, particularly after the Second World War, where this ambiguity is felt even more sharply than ever. In her own words, I quote her, "Men of today seem to feel more acutely than ever the paradox of their condition. They know themselves to be the supreme end to which all action should be subordinated, but the exigencies of action force them to treat one another as instruments or obstacles or as means. The more widespread their mastery of the world, the more they find themselves crushed by uncontrollable forces. Though they are the masters of the atomic bomb, yet it is created only to destroy them. Each one has the incomparable taste in his mouth of his own life, and yet each feels himself more insignificant than an insect with an immense collectivity whose limits are one with the earth's. Perhaps in no other age have they manifested their grandeur more brilliantly, and in no other age has this grandeur been so horribly flouted." It's a long quote, but the idea is our condition is essentially paradoxical. On the one hand, we see ourselves having a supreme end, we are end by ourselves. But then we also realize that most of our actions should be subordinated. because the demands of the action make us sometimes a means for others or even obstacles for others. We also sometimes show so much mastery over the world, but sometimes there are uncontrollable forces that exercise mastery over us. For example, because of our mastery, we create atomic bomb, but we realize it's the same atomic bomb that we create can destroy us. So the forces that on which we have no control. So we enjoy our own life. We have a kind of a grasp of our own life, as she calls this incomparable taste of one's life. But at the same time, we realize we are not any more significant than an ordinary insect, because as long as the limits are concerned, we are the same as they are. And we have our grandeur, but this grandeur is often challenged. So this is the paradoxical human condition. Now, we need to be aware of this human condition when he speaks about ethics. Otherwise, you will end up either creating an ethics where you would become a hero, that you are the master of everything, or you would end up creating a slave morality by which you would be simply subordinating yourself to the forces that are from outside. Simone de Beauvoir, therefore, in the face of ambiguity, wants us to have a tough-mindedness. The tough-mindedness would mean that we learn to live with this ambiguity. And by learning to live with this ambiguity, we try to make something of it rather than attempting to deny this ambiguity. And this is an existential contribution to ethics from her point of view. However, there are some objections that are made to existentialism, particularly in terms of the possibility of ethics. People have said, can existentialism really provide a platform for ethics? Because existentialism promotes a philosophy of despair and even sometimes non-action. Some of the existential philosophers have this idea. Obviously, despair is a common theme that runs through existentialism. Some people would say, look, for example, Sartre, on what grounds could he suggest for an ethics? Because after all, he considers man as a useless passion. In other words, existentialism is a philosophy which is negative, defining man in terms of a useless passion, and therefore incapable of any ethics. Simone de Beauvoir tries to counter this. And then she says, well, any ethics starts with a negative statement of human affairs. For example, we keep saying human being is in fallen state, but the human being is redeemable. People are irrational because of their instincts, but at the same time, these instincts can be sublimated. For example, she invokes Hegel's idea of displacement to explain this idea. And she concludes, in her own words, this means that there can be a having to be only for a being who, according to the existentialist definition, questions himself in his being, a being who is at a distance from himself and who has to be his being. In other words, all that she's trying to say is, using the notion of displacement, in the existentialist scheme of things, we are able to distance ourselves, take a step back, and it is this distance from ourselves, of course, and it is this distance that makes ethics possible. So, in simple terms, for her, in order for ethics to be possible, there should be a gap, that I must be able to take a step backward. There must be a separation. Now, how does this gap or the separation fit in with the idea of Sartre that human person is a useless passion? The useless passion that Sartre describes is basically the failure of the humans to completely coincide their in itself with for itself. So we are being for itself, we have the consciousness, but at the same time we are also in itself, in a certain sense, where our consciousness can sometimes be objectified by the gaze of the other. If you remember Sartre, there is always this tension in which we live. Now, because of this fact that you are never able to completely bring to a perfect harmony this being for itself and the being in itself. And this inability of ours to bring to a perfect harmony, the being for itself and the being in itself, is what Sartre calls the useless passion. So therefore, in the idea of Sartre, you are a being whose wills and desires cannot be perfectly synchronized with the world around it. If you think you can completely synchronize your will and desire to the world around you, then you become the ground of your existence. In other words, you create a passion by which you try to be God. And that is an impossible passion. It is a useless passion. You cannot be a ground of your existence. So this useless passion is that passion of trying to be God. Because after all, somebody to be the ground of your existence could be considered as a metaphysical entity. For the theistic frame of reference, it would be God. And therefore, by trying to reconcile to this, both of this, being for itself and being for itself in the perfect way, you try to make yourself the ground of your existence, and this passion is useless because you will never be able to succeed. You can never play God. So this is the failure of human beings. Now, therefore, this is not something that you can think of, denying the possibility of ethics. It is basically the failure of your inability to completely bring to a perfect harmony these two aspects of existence, trying to make yourself the ground of your existence or trying to play God. Simone de Beauvoir also looks at from another perspective. From that perspective, she would say we don't need to think of that it as a failure, but we can also think of it as a possibility of success. Simone de Beauvoir again takes inspiration from Sartre, particularly his famous work Being and Nothingness, where he describes human being as a being who makes himself a lack in order that there may be being. Human being makes himself or herself a lack of being in order that there may be being. Now, let us try to understand this. We make ourselves the lack. That human person makes himself or herself the lack, which implies a certain passion in one's own choosing. I choose myself to be a lack. A lack here should be understood as taking a distance from myself. Lack here refers therefore to the separation which makes us desire. It makes us desire, it makes us to act, it even makes our passion possible. So everything that make us desire, that make us to act and make us to have passion, that you separate yourself from that. I want something because it is something I do not have or I am not. So lack is basically the ability to recognize I don't have something. That is why I am in need of it. I want it. I desire it. So desire is fundamentally a lack in that sense. I want something because it is something I do not have or I am not. And this wanting is determined by humans themselves without being compelled from the outside. So this lack is a separation, but at the same time, it is by which I also recognize that what I don't have or what I am not. So because it doesn't have any external influence, external compulsion, this particular way of myself making me a lack does not have any relation to the external world. Because it does not have any relation to the external world, we cannot talk of this particular aspect as useful or useless. Because we can speak of something as useful or useless only when we are able to relate to the external world. Insofar as it is not related to the external world, there is no question of this usefulness or uselessness that arises. Therefore, usefulness or uselessness can only be defined in the human world established by your projects and the ends you set up. So nothing is useful or nothing is useless in this original situation of lack. The original situation you find yourself not having, or you are not something. So it must be understood, therefore, that the passion to which man has has been yielded finds no external justification. So according to de Beauvoir, that the inability to be fully be at one with the world, therefore, is not a failure. But she would say it is the opposite of it. That you are not fully, you are not fully be at one with the world, need not be seen as a failure, but it can be seen as a possibility of success. How is that? By uprooting yourself from the world, you make yourself present to the world, and at the same time make the world present to yourself. It is like, you like a landscape, for example. Let's say, imagine that you are going to a beautiful mountain region, or for example, people go to Lonavala when there is a monsoon season. You kind of enjoy that landscape, and you probably like to be the landscape. You would like to be that little sky that you see above the mountain, or this quiet water, and so on. So it might be, it must be something that you want to be experiencing within your flesh and bone, but at the same time you remain at a distance. It is because of this distance the sky and the water exist before me. I cannot appropriate, for example, the snow field where I slide. It must remain foreign to me. But at the same time, I take delight in this very effort toward an impossible possession. So the fact that I take delight in the very effort toward the impossible possession should be understood not as a defeat for Simone de Beauvoir, but it gives me joy, and therefore it is to be seen as a triumph. It's a possibility of success. In other words, human person, in his or her vain attempt to be God, precisely makes himself or herself exist as man. So therefore, there is an attempt, precisely in this attempt to be God, you realize you exist as human being. And if you are satisfied with this existence, then you coincide with yourself. So therefore, it is possible for a human person to want this tension even with the failure which it involves. His being is lack of being, but this lack as a way of being, which is precisely existence. So she gives a positive twist to this idea of useless passion. So it need not be seen as a failure, but as a possibility of success. Well, I cannot play God, but it is there I realize my existence as human. And it is, my being is precisely this lack of being, that I am not this. And this lack has a way of being, which is my existence. Now, this change of perspective that Simone de Beauvoir adopts from wanting to be stable, a fully grounded being, to accepting the ambiguity, is what she calls an existential conversion. It is a conversion because I want to be a stable, fully grounded being. I am grounded on certain thing, or on me something else can be grounded. I become the ground of being, ground of my existence. That's a very stable way of looking at it. Now I realize there is an ambiguity. And this perspective that I can adopt is my conversion, my existentialist conversion. Why it is an existentialist conversion? Because it does not suppress my instincts, my desires, or my passions. It only prevents any possibility of failure by refusing to set up absolutes, by refusing to set up as absolutes the ends toward which my transcendence thrusts itself, and by considering them in their connection with the freedom which projects them. These are her words. I repeat that. The existentialist conversion does not suppress my instincts, desires, and passions. It merely prevents any possibility of failure by refusing to set up as absolutes the ends towards which my transcendence thrusts itself, and by considering them in their connection with the freedom which projects them. And since this lack, which positively described is called freedom, is the grounding of human action and desires. Now note this lack, which is positively called described freedom, and that is grounding my action and desire. And therefore de Beauvoir argues that there can be no external justification of values. Therefore there cannot be anything that has absolute values outside of me. But at the same time, we cannot say there is, everything is therefore pessimistic. There are no value, or there cannot be value. That kind of a pessimistic, because while you reject these absolute values, you also reject the pessimism, because pessimism implies a failure measured from an objective point of view. So only when you have an objective point of view, you can say that, well, I cannot be up to this mark, because there is a value that is outside of you by which you would say that I cannot measure up to that. So that is where the negativity comes, the pessimism comes. Therefore, there is no absolute condemnation of human existence, because human just exists. For human, it is not a question of wondering whether his or her presence in the world is useful, whether life is worth the trouble of being lived. These questions for de Beauvoir makes no sense. It is a matter of knowing how we want to live, under what conditions. So it is not so much about the external factor. True, we have certain external factor, we cannot escape that. But the question is not whether that is useful to me, the external world is useful to me, whether life is worth the trouble of living. No. Under what standards do I want to live my life? Now that is a very existential question for her. So the whole of ethics is very primarily existential. The fact of this existential way of leading ethics comes from this ambiguity. Simone de Beauvoir answers Dostoevsky's challenge. Now, what is the Dostoevsky's challenge? Dostoevsky stated, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. What does it mean? Idea is that if there is no God, then against whom am I going to measure what is a value, what is right, what is wrong? And therefore, if God doesn't exist, there is no ground of my ethics, there is no yardstick to judge what is right and what is wrong, and therefore everything is permitted. So only when there is a God, then he would say, well, this is allowed, this is not allowed, this is right. So what makes something right or wrong is depending on what God has made to be right or wrong. Now remember, the word God has to be taken not merely into the theistic formula, but as the ground of moral values. So what grounds the moral reality. So it has to be taken in a broader sense. Now there is an objectivity, that's what it means. Simone de Beauvoir reverses this particular challenge of Dostoevsky by saying that if there is a God to forgive and pardon, action loses its meaning. Because ultimately, when you say that what is right and wrong is decided by the ground, a being that grounds these moral values, but he also would say the being that grounds these moral values can also forgive or pardon what you do, then it loses all its meaning. So I quote her, it's again a long quote, but it's a wonderful quote. If it is claimed that whatever the case may be, this earthly stake has no importance, this is precisely because one invokes the inhuman objectivity which we declined at the start. One cannot start by saying that our earthly destiny has or has not importance, for it depends upon us to give it importance. I repeat, one cannot start by saying that our earthly destiny has or has not importance, for it depends upon us to give it importance. It is up to man to make it important to be a man, and he alone can feel his success or failure. Now, this is a wonderful quote by Simone de Beauvoir. If it is objected that the person is free to refuse to give his life importance, then de Beauvoir argues that even in the religious worldview, a person is free to make mistake. Even in the religious, the worldview, then there are people who are saved and there are also people who are damned. This does not only apply to religion. De Beauvoir will argue that in a deterministic worldview, now this is a deterministic worldview. When there is a ground of being in which your morality, your moral values are drawn, from which your moral values are drawn, then there is a determinism that is already in place. So hardly you have got any freedom of choice. Now, in this deterministic worldview, this not only includes religion but also Marxism for her. There is still room for not doing what is necessary, for having praise and blame. So even within the deterministic worldview, you are free to commit mistake. Even in the deterministic worldview, that there is still, you will be praised, you will be blamed. The fact that you will be praised and you will be blamed would imply that you have a certain freedom. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. Why would people praise you when you do something unless you have done it freely? If you are determined to do something and you did by the fact of you being determined, then what is the point why people should praise you? Or you do something because of the fact that you are determined to do so, not by yourself but by the external conditions that you are there is a determinism in you by which you end up doing it. How can anybody blame you? So freedom keeps reasserting itself. One of the things that obviously this kind of thinking would lead to is, then we are finally saying that I alone exist. I alone am the master of my values. So I alone matter. So this view is called solipsism. Simone de Beauvoir defends against the charge of solipsism. How does she do that? According to her, this charge of solipsism only makes sense when one denies the ambiguous state of humans, because it assumes a pure interiority without a world outside. But for de Beauvoir, the outside world exists, other humans exist, and it is a plurality of humans as opposed to the idea of universal humanity that values are created. So this will be developed, Simone de Beauvoir particularly develops this in the third part, particularly when she deals with the question of politics. So, but then she is not, kind of accepting the charge that her idea of this ambiguity, therefore this ethics that she is suggesting is leading to a kind of solipsism. No, it is not, because she is not speaking about the pure interiority. You remember right from the beginning she said one or the other cannot be denied. So I am not a pure interiority, nor am I merely an object, a pure object. So this ambiguity will always be there. So therefore, for her, the outside world exists, other humans exist, and in fact, this plurality of humans, as opposed to the abstract idea of the universal humanity, that enables the values to be made. So after discussing the initial conditions, Simone de Beauvoir goes on to develop a theory of action in the context of freedom. Now you remember there was initial discussion, initial distinction that she made of wanting to be and wanting to disclose being. So action for her is trying to be something. If that is the case, then it would be a failure. So if you think action as trying to be something, it would be a failure. But suppose if you say you want to wish for the disclosure of the world and to assert yourself as freedom, and it happens at the same moment, then obviously freedom is the source from which all significations, in other words meaning, and the value come forth. Now this is the original condition of all justification of existence. Now this is very Heideggerian way of thinking, wanting to disclose being. So wanting to disclose being is basically by in assertion of your freedom, you also disclose the world, and it happens at the same time. So it is in and through the freedom, meaning emerges. In and through the freedom, value emerges. Now meaning not only in terms of ethical meaning, but also meaning in every other aspect, meaning about the external world, meaning about life itself. So this is the condition of justification for all existence. The man who seeks to justify his life must want freedom itself above everything else. So again she rejoins the idea of Sartre, human person is condemned to be free. If man is free, how can he will freedom? De Beauvoir argues that freedom is not something that one has or one does not have. There are differences in how the freedom is used. Now at first there is spontaneity. Now spontaneity, if you consider from the point of view of your thrownness, the Heideggerian use of the term, the facticity, then it appears to us as pure contingency. It is not necessary. It can be something that comes out like as stupid sometimes. So for these spontaneous actions to have any coherence and not to become something of stupidity, it must have to project itself towards something. For this project to have meaning, it needs duration. So Simone de Beauvoir would say, I quote her, one escapes the absurdity only by escaping the absurdity of the pure moment. An existence would be unable to found itself if moment by moment it crumbled into nothingness. That is why no moral question presents itself to the child as long as he is still incapable of recognizing himself in the past or seeing himself in the future. In other words, the spontaneity alone doesn't matter. You need to have a project, and we need to project to something else. And this project is always to the future, and therefore it is indefinite, and therefore there is a constant way in which your will is engaged. You need to constantly return to this unity of project in which you are engaged. This does not mean for Simone de Beauvoir that action has to be repeated forever, but that each project in disclosing being opens up the possibility of new projects and relations. And all these projects are founded in the beginning conditions of freedom. So project basically means your ability to project yourself to the future. So what Heidegger would call, the whole way in which he would say, the hermeneutical way in which he say that precisely is understanding. Understanding is your ability to become, to project yourself to the possibilities, to free the innumerable possibilities. And therefore, for freedom is the foundation of this project. And there would be limits, obviously, but these limits do not mean failure. There would be obstacles, even difficult ones. This does not mean we have to give up our projects. In fact, if you resign to your project because it is difficult, then that is the saddest thing for Simone de Beauvoir. Because once you give up realizing your project, you are making freedom an abstract concept. You are not making freedom concrete and real. So you end up being a passive person. You are not anymore active, not exercising your freedom to constantly keep projecting, in and through your freedom. So therefore you are becoming incapable of action. So she would say this is what distinguishes the existentialist freedom from the Stoic freedom. The Stoic freedom only recognizes things that are in our control. So that is what is freedom. So we need to be indifferent to anything else. The famous prayer of Stoic prayer. I mean, I like that prayer. It is sometimes very comforting. But see, for Simone de Beauvoir, then you are kind of looking at freedom in a very narrow sense. What you can have control of. Now, freedom cannot be just what you can have control of. You cannot give up. You have to constantly keep projecting yourself to the future, even if it is difficult, even if you think it is impossible. So there is a certain attitude of the kind of fighting back is very strongly there. Now the Stoic prayer is very simple. Grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now this is typically a Stoic form of prayer. So there are things I have control over which I must be able to do. There are things I don't have control over. I must be able to accept that. And then I should have the wisdom to know the difference. Now, the opposite of this is a kind of resignation for her. The opposite of this resignation is the willing of freedom. Because when the project is based on freedom, then movement is always possible. Obviously, we always admire a person who, in spite of all his difficulties, all the obstacles, he knows how to take the upper hand and keeps renewing himself, engaging in the world, and thereby strongly asserts his freedom in relation to things. So obviously these are the people whom people would admire as heroes. So that would be the existentialist understanding of freedom. The future is essential for the idea of freedom. Why is the future is essential for the idea of freedom? Because you are projecting. A project is something that is towards the future. It is not something merely of the present. Because without the future of possibilities, the human person may not justify his existence positively, and he or she feels its contingency with disgust. That is why there is no more obnoxious way to punish a man than to force him to perform acts which make no sense to him, as one empties and fills the same ditch indefinitely. When one makes soldiers who are being punished march up and down, or when one forces a schoolboy to copy lines. When we are children, the imposition is the normal punishment. Now you have to copy the lines over and over again. It is absolutely meaningless. That is why, because you are not able to project anything, you are not able to create a project, and therefore there is no way in which you can justify your existence in a positive way. And that is why this is a disgust. I mean, anything that is repetitive for that matter. For example, in September 1946, revolt broke out in Italy because the unemployed were set to break pebbles which served no purpose whatsoever. So, as is well known, this was also the weakness which ruined the national workshops in 1848. This mystification of useless effort is more intolerable than fatigue. Now, you should understand, she is making a reference to Camus with a little criticism. You remember Camus, that whole idea of the myth of Sisyphus, where he is rolling the stone upwards. It's intolerable than fatigue. Whereas Camus sees that as a courageous despair, she sees that as precisely lack of project, and therefore the very idea of freedom is challenged. So this part sets up the justification for revolt against those who try and deny one's freedom, and this is further developed in a chapter on politics in part 2. Okay, now let us conclude this particular chapter. After talking about how willing oneself free is possible, Simone de Beauvoir continues the discussion about how it is possible not to will oneself free. How can one refuse to choose? This goes back to the condition of lack again. Unlike Kant, who saw humans as fully positive, meaning they are who they are, Simone de Beauvoir argues that the negative aspect of human condition makes it possible for a bad will. She says that this gives in existentialism a possibility of evil, which most humanistic philosophers cannot account for, that gives it even greater urgency. The conclusion of this chapter sets up the beginning of next, where Simone de Beauvoir talks about the variety of people who can deny or escape their original freedom and the consequences that it leads to. So the second part deals basically with the personal freedom and others. Here, of course, the freedom and responsibility are to be seen on par, and that is the subject matter of this chapter. The problem starts in the childhood. When we are children, the world appears ready-made for us. There is a world of adults who have all the answers and live in a stable world where we do not have to be responsible for anything or anyone or anything else. So this is the world which is a ready-made answer. So everything has an answer. If you look at some people are very quick to give answers. I mean, actually a good philosopher is the one who does not give answers immediately, but asks the good question. In fact, now Simone de Beauvoir would say this sense of childhood might also extend into adulthood, when people are never allowed to assume responsibility or freedom, such as in conditions of subjugation or slavery. So we are often given an idea of a perfect world where everything has a place, and this is the place in which it has to be. I mean, the Western world had already this hierarchical mindset where everything is in its place. You don't challenge that. I mean, if you challenge that, it's as though you have no freedom within that scheme of things. It's a well-ordered world. I mean, in India we have a similar kind of hierarchical structure. In order to get along with the power that subjugates them, they align themselves to their masters like children align themselves to adults. It's much easier to align yourself to those people who are controlling you rather than to revolt. But barring such external pressures, and even within them, this illusion of a stable, ready-made world starts dissipating soon enough. De Beauvoir described this as the awakening of a child into adolescence as such. So with astonishment, revolt and disrespect, the child little by little asks itself, why must I act this way? What good is it? And what will happen if I act in another way? Now, it's very true. That's very spontaneous question that people would ask. Especially that is why we speak about the adolescent, assertion where when you are so much controlled by your parents in the adolescent, there is a tendency to revolt. Why should I be doing all this thing what you are telling me to do? Why can't I do things what I want to do? So that is where you discover the subjectivity. And then you also discover the others have equally subjectivity as you have. So when you arrive at the adolescence, you begin to vacillate between, vacillate because of the contradictions that you notice among adults as well as their hesitations and weakness. So you don't look at others as, as if they were gods, because they also have their own hesitation, their own weakness. You discover the human character of reality. Language, customs, ethics and values have their sources therefore in certain uncertain people. People are not all that sure, they have hesitations. So you realize that at a later stage. Otherwise you are very sure about what others tell you. In the childhood you just literally follow what others say because that becomes a gospel truth for you. The moment has come when the adolescent is going to be called upon to participate in this operation. Therefore his acts weigh upon the earth as much as those of other men. So you will have to choose and decide. That is, when you realize the weight and the consequences of your existence. So as long as you are a child, when things are to be told that you do that, it's rather easy. As an adolescent, you react, you revolt. But then you will be part of the whole system in which you will have to create. You will be creating meaning and values, and that is going to weigh on you very deeply and very, very powerfully. So this realization is joyful because you are free. You are no longer defenseless before the obscure past which directed the course of things. But at the same time, it is very anxious. It is anxious because now you have to face the world without the safety which a child had, which you had a child had, and therefore probably time and again you have this nostalgia because that safety net is now missing for you. To see how this anxiety and nostalgia can be a denial of freedom, Simone de Beauvoir makes hierarchy of various types of escape from freedom. So there are various types of escape that people try to have from freedom. Believe me, it's very easy to accept a life without freedom than with freedom, because with freedom, too much challenge, too much responsibility, too much burden. That is why sometimes we long for that lost childhood where everything of us is taken care of. We are just told what to do, we do. Freedom is very frightening oftentimes, though we long for freedom. When given, it is frightening. So at the bottom of this, so there is always a constant way in which people try to escape freedom, and there are different hierarchy. And then at the bottom of this hierarchy is what she terms the sub-man. What is this sub-man? This person refuses outright to have any positive engagement with the world. No positive involvement in the world. This man, when Simone de Beauvoir writes man, obviously this is a French way of writing. They will use the word homme, obviously translate as man, but we can think of both man and woman. There is no word by which they could use a gender-free language in French, obviously. In English, we can say human person, but then again, the personal pronoun he or she. So you remember this for everybody. It's not just man means not just the male, but also the female. So sub-man, you can translate as subhuman. Okay. So this person, rejects any possibility of any engagement in the world, and therefore there is no responsibility for oneself. So his life or her life is only a pure facticity. You remember the word facticity, the pure givenness in the world. So this person has fear to take on any projects, engaging in any possibilities, towards the future or around yourself. So rejects it completely. So this person will see the world as very dull, obviously, because there is no reason for him to exist in that sense. So there is no commitment whatsoever. This person can be very, very does not have an opinion of his own, obviously, because there is no commitment. He or she can be swayed away by others. This is called subman, subhuman. So what is wrong to think? What is wrong to think of the subman as a slacker? Because the subhuman's apathy can turn dangerous. Now, this person, because it does not have any involvement in the world, this person has only apathy. The world appears as uncontrollable force overwhelming him. He will fall prey to any form of evil going on around him. So it may be quite interesting to ask ourselves this question. Such person, such subman for de Beauvoir realizes himself or herself in the world of a blind, uncontrolled force which anybody can get control of. So she gives the example in all lynchings, in all programs of the bloody movements organized by the fanaticism of seriousness and passion. Actually the submen are the one who do the dirty work. That's quite fascinating. Look at from the Indian context as well. Who are the men who would be doing all kind of violent action in the name of religion or in the name of caste, in the name of gender, whatever it is? People who are submen. They are the ones who are recruited to do that. Well, somebody else makes them to do that, controlling them, obviously. So, because they realize they are part of a blind, uncontrolled force, that anybody can control them. Because they have no freedom. They think they have no freedom. That's why to be submen or subhuman is very dangerous, because the more and more that they have this apathy, and therefore they have no qualms of conscience, because this is what I am told to do, that you do that. You go and destroy somebody, some family, some women, some particular group of people, you just do it. And it's very true in India. People who are seen as being violent are not the genius who create the operation. They are behind the stage, but they are enacted by the subman. The subman's relation to the world is ultimately, therefore, one of terror. I quote Simone de Beauvoir. It's again a long quote, but it is worth listening to. The subman experiences the desert of the world in his boredom, and the strange character of a universe with which he has created no bond also arouses fear in him. Weighted down by present events, he is bewildered before the darkness of the future, which is haunted by frightful specters, war, sickness, revolution, fascism, and so on. The more indistinct these dangers are, the more fearful they become. The subman is not very clear about what he has to lose, since he has nothing. But this very uncertainty reinforces his terror. Indeed, what he fears is that the shock of the unforeseen may remind him of the agonizing consciousness of himself. So basically, the subman is the one, he is full of fear, but also the one who converts the fear into terror. So in order to alleviate the fears, the subhuman can decide to give away all his freedom to a single object, to devote himself to a cause or an idea. I mean, this is what happens in the terrorist group as well. Okay. This is the situation de Beauvoir calls the serious man. Now, the serious man gives up their freedom by making this cause or idea their everything. Now, from subman, you are becoming a serious man. Now, this is where you are full of ideologies. You are devoting yourself to a particular cause. I want to, by all means establish this particular value that I find very, 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 close to me. I mean, whether it could be a nationalistic idea or a religious idea, whatever it is. It is almost an inversion of childhood. In other words, you see everything as ready-made. So the serious man wants to be, somebody who wants to get everything as ready-made, which is given to you. Some kind of ideologically loaded world. The serious man knows his freedom, but nonetheless chooses to remain chained. So that is the difference between the subman and the serious man. The subman is at the lower level of hierarchy because he is not even conscious of his freedom, or he denies his freedom. Now this guy knows, the serious man knows his freedom, but then he remains to remain chained. That is why sometimes you find some of the great intellectuals can commit to an ideological cause, and then they cannot think otherwise. Very close-minded. Now you could be a member of a party, you could be a member of a religious society, or whatever it is. Because he is no longer a man, he falls prey to the political fanaticism which empties politics of all human contact and imposes the state, not for the individuals, but against them. I repeat that. That's a famous quote from her. Because the serious man is no longer a man, he falls prey to the political fanaticism which empties politics of all content and imposes the state, not for individuals but against them. So the serious man can only justify his absurd cause by denying the seriousness of others, making fun of their causes or their projects. I mean, this is what exactly you see in the TV debates. You see, some will do it by cultivating a sense of humor, which mocks the cause of others. This was termed as the fascist sense of humor. Others will devote their will entirely to their idol, and in all other aspects, they are like subman. So she gives the example from Proust of a doctor who has a great skill in his profession, but outside of his speciality, to be lacking in sensitivity, intelligence, and humanity. So these people may be very skillful in their particular field. They may be very good. I mean, they are intelligent. They are not stupid or anything. But outside of their particular speciality, they will be lacking in sensitivity, intelligence, and humanity. When the cause or causes become everything, everything is judged useful or useless within the reason for the cause. So that kind of narrative now keeps emerging in India. Everything is about a certain kind of nationalist discourse, certain kind of religious discourse, and everything else should be seen from that point of view. And so many people, I mean, very serious-minded people, serious man, very skilled in their own perspective, their own profession, but we can see be kind of chained to this kind of ideological worldview. But the serious man does not see it because he thinks it useful or useless. That's all. Period. There's nothing about beyond that. So a serious man is therefore frustrated by the inability to be anything and can decide to become nothing. Now, this stage de Beauvoir describes as nihilism. So this is another stage: subman, serious man, nihilism. This attitude is different from the lack of existentialism which she described earlier. So a nihilist is not the same as the existentialist lack. The nihilist feels this lack and reacts to it negatively. The nihilist also may go for purely rejecting everything around him. The serious man made following the object the source of his life. The nihilist makes destroying the object his goal. Or they may go even further and try and annihilate themselves, which can also mean annihilating others that give them existence. So nihilism is a kind of where you want to you can really turn very violent at the nihilist stage. I mean, not because you are acknowledging a lack, but then you are reacting negatively. You are in the denial of everything, denial of any goal whatsoever. You can also deny the existence itself, and therefore you can turn violent towards existence itself. Now, for such a position, of course, cannot be sustained too long, and the rejection of the world can be self-destructive, and this again can return to a form of subman. So each of this stage in the hierarchy is not in that sense very strictly compartmentalized. There is always a possibility move from one to another. In fact, de Beauvoir describes Nazism primarily as a nihilistic move destroying a certain old bourgeois values before itself becoming a new serious cause. So, but within nihilism, as opposed to the subhuman or the serious, there is first realization of the ambiguity realization of the ambiguity of existence. De Beauvoir described the possibility of genuine freedom within them. From the nihilistic stance, other possibilities arise, because within a nihilistic stance, a person might still experience the delight in existing. So he or she might throw himself in activity and take in all the delights of the world. So this is where you become an adventurer. So if nihilism has to be only a phase, it is okay. If it doesn't slip back to subman, or if it doesn't turn to be violent and destructive. So if you become adventurer, then this is the first of the stages to experience freedom. And so the first to be able to make moral choices from the existentialist point of view. Because the adventurer does not propose to be, he deliberately makes himself a lack of being. He aims expressly at existence. Though engaged in his understanding, he is at the same time detached from the goal. Whether he succeeds or fails, he goes right ahead throwing himself into a new enterprise, to which he will give himself in the same indifferent order. So the adventurer is much further than the nihilist or the serious man, but he is not quite there. De Beauvoir finds two faults in the adventurer. First, he might still be pursuing adventure in the name of a serious cause, just like the serious man. And secondly, he is completely indifferent to the freedom of others and therefore the consequences of action, his own action. So even then, being an adventurer itself, it's only the beginning of experience of freedom, but it is not, he is not quite there at fully exercising his freedom. He's, is still indifferent to the freedom of others. Okay. So insofar as a person can become conscious of the real requirements of his freedom, which can will itself only by destining itself to open future, by seeking to extend itself by means of freedom of others, then he has genuine freedom. So you are not only conscious of your own freedom, but you also will that to open future, but at the same time you try to extend it itself by means of the freedom of others. So you are also conscious about the freedom of others. Okay. I think I will stop here. There is the conclusion is basically to will oneself free is also to will others free. So this is the take home of this particular chapter. Thank you very much.